Hello everyone, welcome to the latest episode of Games Up podcast. It's slightly different than the one you were expecting because it's slightly different than the one we were expecting. Originally we were going to do an episode on EGX as we do every year. It's EGX time, it's what we have to do. And EGX is awesome, it's really good fun, we got to play amazing games and we can't wait to talk about it, but it can wait until next week. See, after the news that we had in the week just gone, we thought we had to talk about the biggest loss to video games in quite a while. We have to talk about Telltale. This week, an announcement was made by the head of Telltale that came as a surprise to the entire gaming community and, I imagine, quite a few of those still working at Telltale Games. The announcement was made that after a year of restructuring and trying very hard to bring Telltale into a place where it was viable for the future, they just couldn't make it happen, and that the studio would be effective basically immediately shutting down. As well as shutting down, they'd be cancelling a number of confirmed projects and one that we were expecting to see in the next couple of weeks. The last season of The Walking Dead is no more. We will not get to see the end of Clementine's story. There won't be any more Wolf Among Us. There will be no Batman Season 3. No more Marvel projects. That's it. Telltale is officially no more. It's been quite a tumultuous week for all the people involved on all sorts of fronts. We've had people like Melissa Hutchinson, who is known for her work in the Walking Dead games, reaching out publicly and saying that she's had a really, really wonderful response of people underneath her, really, really showing her that support that she needs, and that's good. But we've also heard from some horror stories of Telltale, some developers who spent a huge amount of time working in crunch on the Walking Dead season that now won't come out. How some of them don't feel that they've been properly compensated for the amount of time they worked on it, and how some of them are not being let go of in the way that we would expect a professional to be let go of. And it's a real shame that not only is this happening to all the wonderful, talented individuals that worked at this company, but that it's happening to this company at all. For a few years, Telltale were one of the biggest success stories of the video game industry. They went from being middling games that people didn't really pick up all that much to being one of its brightest stars. The Walking Dead Season 1 was an absolute turning point from them, and they went to being something that people didn't pay much attention to something that people expected and anticipated year on year. The Walking Dead is one of gaming's finest stories, and it's a real kick to every one of its fans that we won't get to see it progress. Personally, I think one of the worst things is how we won't get to see Telltale progress. They recently started to make strides in a direction that looked really, really good for them. After years of requests from fans, they said that they were working on upgrading their engine, which would make their games even better. Their games have been known to be a little janky here and there, missing a little bit of polish. They struggled to perform sometimes, and Telltale really looked like they were making steps to make this better. Something that's always been at the core of Telltale games and has always been pretty goddamn solid, though, was the story. And I would have loved to see Telltale make different stories. We got to see them do loads of cool things. We got to see them make a season of Guardians of the Galaxy, for crying out loud. But I would have liked to see them expand beyond known IPs. It would be cool to have seen them go on and make their own stories and build their own franchises that gaming would have appreciated more than just characters they already know. I would have liked to see them branch out from their episodic kind of structure. What would a full 40-hour game look like from Telltale? Or even less than that, what would a full 2-hour walking game look like from Telltale? What could a VR experience look like from Telltale? I genuinely believe they were one of the studios that could have brought some of the technology that looks like it's set to be in gaming's future and turned it into something very tangible, especially with the talent they had behind the writing of those games. And it's such a sour note to end such a wonderful week that we just won't see any of it happen. So why has this happened from Telltale? Well, it's hard to say. We might be witnessing the beginning of something that all developers fear and that happens quite frequently in the video game industry, which is the middle falling out. To give you a bit of context, the gaming industry very often has huge, big-name AAA developers at one end of it that make the most expensive games that are also typically the most formulaic, the most reliable, but perhaps not the most innovative. And they tend to cost the most. This is known as the top end. And on the other end, you have small-time developers, developers who still devote their time to video games but are only made up perhaps of one person in a team or a few people in a team. Perhaps they have very little investment, or they're making something that's crazy and innovative. Maybe it came from a game jam, or it was the kind of thing they developed while they were going through education. They're the teams who aren't backed by major studios and tend to be independent. These have always been there in gaming, and they often go through renaissances when the middle, which are the developers in between these two, fall out. See, the middle are games that are risky, sometimes innovative, sometimes formulaic, but often not backed with the same amount of money as those high-end games. They try and compete on the same level. The Walking Dead, for example, will be considered among its peers of the time like The Last of Us, but it wouldn't have had the same monetary input that anything from Sony had. And these developers often either become the top end or fall out entirely. We saw it happen in this generation when Rocksteady and CD Projekt Red released a single game that has taken them to the top end of gaming. They now undeniably have huge teams, huge budgets, and their output is anticipated so highly that they can bank on those sales to some extent. Rockstar are exactly the same. They put out one game this generation before Red Dead comes out in a couple of months. Middle-end developers can't rely on that stuff. They have to put out content more regularly to keep those sales going, to keep their business going. And Telltale seem to have struggled with this. Another thing that I think may have led to the problems with Telltale is the amount of licenses that they must have paid into. If you think about how many things they've brought out since the first series of The Walking Dead, it's huge. The Walking Dead, of course, but also The Wolf Among Us, which was the Fables universe. They also had Borderlands, they also had Batman, they also had Game of Thrones, they also had Marvel and Minecraft, and this seems like these were just the games that made it to the market. They put a huge amount of content out in a very small amount of time, and they must have invested in a lot of these. It worries me because we're seeing THQ Nordic do the same thing at the minute. I feel like THQ Nordic buy a different developer or a different license every week, but I can't think of the last THQ Nordic game I actually played. The middle falls out in games quite regularly, and it's a really horrible thing when it does. And Telltale may have been the first victim of it this generation. Or maybe it's just something smaller. Maybe just the management wasn't right, or the investment wasn't done properly. It could be a number of things. But to me, the saddest note of all of this is the time that it's happened. When Telltale brought out The Walking Dead, it was such a big hit because story was not so heavily focused on. The Last of Us was exactly the same. We started to see multiplayer games and games as a service rise to the top of the charts, and story started to go to the wayside, and that continued through this generation. I love a number of the video games I play, like Overwatch or PUBG, but I'll be the first to admit to you that the story is not the most prominent thing in them. I still like the way that Overwatch does story, but it's not the most prominent feature of those games. Telltale forged on and made story the core part of what their video games did. You played characters, and those characters existed in a real world, and the decisions and choices and opinions you held within those characters, within those worlds, mattered. That was a big thing for a developer of their size, and you can see the effects that it has. I feel like we're starting to get to a point where story is having a real renaissance in video games. Look at games like Nier Automata, which rose to the popularity they did because of the stories they told. In recent weeks, we've seen Spider-Man become Sony's biggest selling first-party exclusive, and loads and loads and loads of people are praising it for the way it tells its story. God of War was the same thing. Just this week we heard that Red Dead Online is being pushed back a couple of weeks so that you have enough time to play and focus on the Red Dead 2 story. And we saw a gameplay trailer that was nearly an hour long. An hour long from CD Projekt Red. That's crazy. And this is the start of it. As we go into the next generation, which is going to happen fairly soon, these companies are going to be forging their way forward. Microsoft is likely going to start investing more heavily on games, and if the rumours we've heard are true, those games are going to be much more story-heavy. The next Fable game cannot be a game-as-a-service game first and foremost. It will not be a battle royale or a gimmick house. It will have to be a story experience. Sony have already made it clear that they're developing story games for the future. Ghosts of Tsushima looks amazing, and it looks amazing because of the world it's set in. To me, the sourest part of the loss of Telltale this week is it seems like they were part of a thing that's changing video games for the better. I like that story is seeming to have a renaissance in video games again. I like that after years of heavy multiplayer focus and Battle Royale taking over everything and loot boxes or season passes, I like that we can look to the future and some of the most exciting games on the horizon are heavily driven by story. There's nothing wrong with gimmicks, there's nothing wrong with multiplayer, there's nothing wrong with any of these things, but it's very exciting to think that the games I'm excited for the next 12 months are Cyberpunk, a story-heavy RPG, and Assassin's Creed, a story-heavy RPG, and it's such a shame that we won't get to say the same thing for Telltale. I would have loved to look back in 3, 4, or 5 years' time and think, I can't believe they brought this story out, or does everyone remember when that trailer dropped for that Telltale game? And now we won't be able to. So I encourage you, if you have the opportunity this week, pick up a Telltale game you haven't picked up before. Or maybe if you don't have the income or opportunity, go and watch a playthrough of a Telltale game, or a podcast about a Telltale game, or a discussion of a Telltale game. Learn a bit more about the things they did, because I think they're going to have an effect on video games for quite a while to come, just Telltale won't be alive to see it. I ask you, raise a glass with me now to Telltale. Thank you for your years of wonderful story games, and I hope that all the people who lost their jobs in what happened this week find their feet well in the video game industry or whichever other industry they choose. They more than deserve it. I'm sorry that this has been such a heavy episode of the show, but I think it's necessary. A big studio like this is a great loss to the industry, and especially all the talent within it. Next week, we'll get back to fun, silly stuff when we talk about EGX games and indie games and this, that, and the other. But this week, we needed to reflect a bit more. Thanks very much. See you next week. And until then, for us and for Telltale, the game's up.